For my second presentation over the top 50 literary journals, I chose the journal Poetry Northwest for a couple different reasons. One is because it has been around since 1959, which I find is quite amazing. Another because they are just strictly poetry, which I love that about journals, about literary journals, how some of them will be are general and then some of them prefer just one genre. The other reason why I chose it is because I do have a love for the Pacific Northwest, and I was really wanting to see if this journal chose any poems that was related mainly to the Pacific Northwest, especially like the Seattle, Puget Sound region. I did notice a couple of different things with their latest archive of poetry. One, there seems to be a sense of loss or despair in many of the poems that they have picked for this journal. Another one, it seems there is a lot of nature elements, and whether it's in plants, animals, just in nature and weather in general. So those are the two biggest themes that I see going on in most of the poems. But somewhere along the way, it seems that there's a sense of death or dying in almost every poem, or at least a sense that things are not going so well. In the first poem that I ran across, it's called Kings Valley, and I thought it was interesting. It's a poem about a town that's pretty much dead or dying. Not a whole lot goes on. It talks about how people only travel one way, and that's in the direction away from Kings Valley. It's known for its dead settlers and Christmas trees. The very first line says, "The neighbor is eating locusts again, as if a plague were just another point of view." So right there it tells you that in this poem we're already getting into a sense that there's death involved. Throughout the poem, it really talks about this town, no one really being able to find a way out if the ones who live there. And it says there's a whole cemetery for land claimers here where locals leave antlers and Hot Wheels and red polyester carnations on the grave they like best. And I found that interesting because in the area where I'm from, that is something that you would see happen as well. Especially the little Hot Wheels on children's graves. But I think that my favorite line in this whole poem, though, because it was so familiar to me, I mean, very, very personal. It says, when only John Wayne is watching from his lacquered saw blade on the wall. If you're not for sure what that means, my uncle was a logger in the Pacific Northwest, and adorned on their walls were the saw blades that people had painted pictures on, whether it was a scenic picture or a deer, different things. And I could remember when I was young, my aunt and uncle gave one to my mom and my dad when they came to Arkansas for a visit. And so from the time that I was a child until probably at least a teenager, this lacquered saw blade adorned my family's living room wall, even though we were not loggers at all. In the next poem that I'm going to discuss, it's called A Bird in My Boot. So again, you are getting a sense of nature elements. The very first line says, "I have a bird in my muck boot, a leak that collects water and squeaks with each step." So we're already getting these elements of nature with the water and the birds. But as we go on down, we start getting into a dark time It says, in a dark time, a poet born near my birthplace wrote, the eye begins to see. Further on down in the poem is when we start seeing the death. It says, until a young man several states away, a child himself, entered a school and shot 20 children. I untacked the quoted syllables from the wall. Madness was madness, that's all. So again, we're seeing this sense of madness and despair and death. That seems to be a continued theme throughout. In another poem, it was by, it won the Joan Swift Memorial Prize poem, which is awarded to a woman poet 65 or older who is residing in the Pacific Northwest. And it was called My Father Leaving. And so this poem, when I read it, actually reminded me so much of my poem that I shared in class earlier in the semester called No Longer the Man I Call My Father. And it's about this woman's father in the hospital bed. He's in the hospital, he's dying, and it's just what's happening as her father is leaving his body for heaven. And so again, there's sadness, there's darkness, there's despair, there's death. And so throughout every one of these poems, it seems that that is completely the theme going on. There was another poem called Growing Up Wild that I really enjoyed, and it really played on the nature aspect. The very first line in this poem says, look how tall the pines loom, how deep glacial streams gash fields of lupine. This whole poem really does a great job of describing elements of nature. Talks about a sky so blue, so ancient, I almost believe humans will never touch it. But as you continue down through the poem, it starts talking about many creatures that slide from our gaze, little flames of meeting. And then it continues on down to where it says, but there is no gentleness between hunger and what feeds it. Oh, it is dangerous to love a child. So again, by the time you get to the end of this poem that starts off so lovely with all of these nature elements, you get down to the end where parasites are grazing the mind of God, and it is dangerous to love a child. And so again, we are getting down into the madness, the death, the despair. And then I think that the last one that I want to just touch on really briefly it's called Poet Wrestling with the Inaccessible Island Rail. And so this one is, it's more speaking on the terms of the island rail, but then it also has so many elements, again, of nature with the sheer sea cliffs. It talks about, it says, say a raven crossed with a sandpiper. So again, you are getting the elements of nature. But as it continues on, it kind of turns, and it talks about having faith and strength with your God. And just talking about these families who grew up along this region. And so this is pretty much the only poem throughout that did not have a clear distinction of death or dying. The only really part of despair that I even touched on said, and without explanation of how you landed on the most remote and extinct volcanic island long after other flightless rails vanished. So really, this poem is the only one that actually had a more upbeat element to it, except that it's all about these families, these 70 families who's on this very remote island together, and they're having to rely on each other and their God for their strength. And so again, you're kind of isolated again, back as you were at the very beginning when I read part of the King's Valley, where it seems like people can never leave. People don't come here. You only see them go in the opposite direction. So I feel like with the Poetry Northwest Journal, it seems like, I don't know if this is every year that they do it or if it just happened to be this past year that they chose this, but it seems that they have picked poems that really have natural or nature elements, something to do with death or despair, and also maybe just a little touch of Pacific Northwest, even if it doesn't quite give you bold pointers that it's set in that area. I feel like every one of them, whether it was the kind of bird in the poem, the weather in the poem, the type of trees, or such as in Kings Valley, the saw blade. I feel like every one of the poems gives you just a little bit of a glimpse of the Pacific Northwest. So I feel like that maybe every year they are going to pick poems that has a connection to their area, but then maybe they're also picking just a neutral theme each year to try to create unity within that journal.